Good morning. So I'm going to talk about naturalism in literature today and provide some ideas that you may have already read about, but that I think may come in handy for your analysis of Jack London's short story To Build a Fire. So, first of all, think of naturalism as a movement that does not connect with the idea of nature in the same way as the Romantics did. In that respect, do not think of naturalism as nature. We will see in what way nature is important for naturalists, but not in the same way as we have studied in Romanticism. Naturalism is connected to the idea of nature in the sense of human nature, in the sense that the movement believed that there are forces that are intrinsic to human nature and that govern that behavior, human behavior, that is. Naturalism was a movement that flourished in the late 1800s through the 1930s. In that respect, also think of the time difference between Romanticism and naturalism. And it was born in a period when there was a boom in scientificism. That is the belief that all phenomena can be scientifically explained. And naturalist writers somehow applied the scientific method to their stories to describe the power of instinct and passion and heredity and the environment on human behavior. So in a way, their stories, their novels, short stories and the like, placed characters in petri dishes, so to speak, as in a lab experiment, and exposed them to situations and described the outcomes of those situations. So behavioral psychology was a blooming science at the time in which naturalism was a movement in literature. And naturalist authors attempted to explain their characters' behavior by the forces of, as I said, heredity, the environment, and instinct. Noticeably, because instinct is natural, hence naturalism, there is no judgment on the part of naturalist authors on their characters' behaviors. So, in the stories, we're going to see that we have simply a mere objective depiction of facts. So stories are centered around the choices that characters make, not so much as the plot development or the action. In this sense, think of London's To Build a Fire and think of the choices the main character makes compared to the choices that the dog makes. In this sense, human beings are seen just as another type of animal. So think of the different choices and how prepared one and the other is to face the situations present or presented to them in the story. Notice that the descriptive style of naturalism aims at objectivity. With no sensationalism, no dramatism, life is simply described free from passions or subjectivity. Characters in naturalism tend to belong to the working classes or the lower middle classes with poor education. So connect these stories to build a fire. And this poor education allowed authors to describe the instinctual responses of their characters, free from higher reasoning skills. We're going to see how that applies to the story. Generally, characters try to exercise free will, but they fall prey to the forces that are beyond their control. In London's To Build a Fire, think of all the instances in which the main character does something freely. For example, build a fire under a tree. And notice, as if this were a scientific experiment, who does better? Is it the man or is it the dog? So generally, these naturalistic experiments portrayed in our stories are urban in naturalism. And the exception is Jack London, whose story we have read. So that is an exception, and bear that in mind. Naturalism usually takes place, or the stories take place, naturalist stories take place in urban settings, in cities, okay? So do not confuse, because our story is set in nature, in the wilderness, that all naturalism does this, only in this case. Plots. Naturalist plots have been described as clinical or chronicles of despair. London's story falls within this definition. Think in what ways this is so. In what way is this a chronicle of despair? So common themes in naturalism are man against nature. Careful, once again, we are not talking about nature as the natural environment or the natural world. Perhaps we're talking about human nature, not the nature of your surroundings, right? Do not confuse naturalism with romanticism. Or another common theme is man against himself. Think of the poor choices our character makes. And also forces of heredity and the environment, and an indifferent God. It's not that naturalists denied the existence of God. Rather, they thought, well, God created the world, that's it, end of story. And then, because of free will, people, characters, would do things, and those things would have repercussions, results. So there is no godly interference here. In naturalism, do not expect a godly salvation, if you will. Man is on his own, right? So, to recap, before we rush to our story. In naturalism, we have characters with little or no education, belonging to the lower strata of society, living in poor conditions. They are victims of circumstances. They use common language. There's a cruel world around our characters, and naturalist stories depict human suffering. The environment, and again, I repeat, not necessarily nature in the case of our story, but not necessarily nature, determines and governs human behavior. Only the strong can survive. Think of the idea of survival of the fittest that was definitely taken up by the naturalists. Think of Darwinism and how this applies to our story. Determinism, that is, was influential in the sense that nothing you can do can change your destiny, because everything has been predetermined. That is determinism. And so the overview is quite pessimistic, right? Not very upbeat. Now, in our story, we have this character that decides to go to see his peers a distance away in the middle of a blizzard, snowstorm, very cold weather. Think of the temperature. It's minus 45, minus 60 degrees Celsius. Now, there is a purpose. He was bound for the old claim on the left fork of Henderson Creek, where the boys were already. Now, there's a lot of detail. Think of these very objective descriptions in naturalism as clinical. I used that term before. And think of how this character is described. For example, he was not much given to thinking, and just then particularly, he had nothing to think about, save that he would eat lunch at the Forks and that at 6 o'clock he will be in camp with the boys. Right? So we have a character and that is repeated over and over. He didn't think that much. Perhaps he knows, or he believes that he knows some things, but he doesn't think about the context. And in this respect, compare our character's actions with the dogs. The dog, for example, is described. Its actions are described as this was a matter of instinct. To permit the ice to remain would mean sore feet. It did not know this. It merely obeyed prompting that arose from the deep crypts of its being. Notice that he did not know this. This is instinct. The dog obeyed mysterious promptings, right? As opposed to our character. The creek, he knew, was frozen clear to the bottom. No creek could contain water in that Arctic weather. But he knew also that there were springs that bubbled out from the hillside. So our character knows. He doesn't need to think. He knows, and he makes choices, and those choices are poor, and eventually, spoiler alert, lead to the outcome of a story. And also think of who was better prepared. Who is the fittest in our story, man or dog? And think of the descriptions of each and how they compare. For example, and all the while the dog sat and watched him, a certain yearning wistfulness in its eyes, for it looked upon him as the fire provider, and the fire was slow in coming. So the dog is all instinct, but prepared. The man who doesn't think, who believes he knows things, makes choices, and that is the free will. And free will doesn't end very well in this story. And some other section, he did this sitting down, and he stood up to do it. And all the while the dog sat in the snow, its wolf brush of a tail curled around warmly over its forefeet. Its sharp wolf ears pricked forward intently as it watched the man. The man is doomed. The dog is not. The dog is prepared. So, when you think of this story and how it ends and how gruesome the descriptions are, think of how objective they are. Notice that on the part of London, there's no judgment as to what the man does, what the dog does. It is simply, this is how it is, right? Somehow placing these two characters, man and dog, on a petri dish and seeing what happened in a situation in which external forces such as nature in this case and the cold weather and the Arctic environment place hurdles, obstacles to these two characters and who does what in what way. Okay, hope this helped. Have a very good day. Stay home, stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you later with some more of other movements. Thank you.